Blood doesn't bother humans. It's the silence preceding it. When the assembly doors blew inward, avian and reptilian delegates scattered like leaves in a hurricane, paralyzed by the sudden violence of a mercenary raid. Council members watching the security feeds expected Earth's soft-spoken diplomats to be the first casualties. They were the galaxy's newcomers, fragile and overly empathetic. Instead, the Council witnessed something that would rewrite biological textbooks. They saw the exact second the smiles vanished and the apex predators woke up. Boredom was a heavier burden than gravity. Ambassador Atticus Graham rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the dull ache of a caffeine withdrawal setting in right behind his eyes. He sat in the center of the Galactic Assembly Chamber, on Station Jericho, surrounded by 50 different species of sentient life, and he was struggling to keep his eyes open. The air in the chamber was heavily filtered, scrubbed of any distinct scent, leaving behind a sterile, metallic tang that irritated the back of his throat. Above him, the vaulted ceilings of the station showcased the slow, majestic rotation of a nearby gas giant. It was a beautiful view. It was also the only interesting thing in the room. For the past 3 hours, Representative Winston, a towering mantis-like being whose name had been roughly anglicized by the translation matrix to make diplomacy easier, had been droning on about trade tariffs on refined tritium. Winston's mandibles clicked rhythmically. His posture was rigid, supported by a natural chitinous exoskeleton that could deflect small arms fire. Atticus adjusted his collar. He smiled. He nodded. He played the part. Earth was the newest member of the Galactic Council. They were the underdogs, the runts of the litter. When the wider galaxy had discovered humanity, they hadn't found a race of terrifying conquerors. They had found a struggling, divided species desperately trying to keep their homeworld from boiling over. The Council viewed humans as soft. They lacked natural armor. They didn't have redundant nervous systems, venom glands, or claws. Their skin was thin, easily bruised, and they bled profusely from minor lacerations. To the rest of the galaxy, humans were highly social, overly emotional primates who relied entirely on pack bonding and technology to survive. They were diplomats, traders, and engineers. They were not, by any biological standard recognized by the Council, fighters. Standing 3 paces behind Atticus's plush chair was Corporal Jenna Miller. She wore the ceremonial dress uniform of the Earth Diplomatic Corps, a crisp, dark blue suit with silver piping. Her hands were clasped loosely behind her back. To Winston, who occasionally glanced at the human security detail with mild amusement, she looked like a decorative fixture. She didn't have the heavy plating of a Kroken's shock trooper, nor the intimidating height of a Valen guard. She was 5'7", completely unarmored, and her only visible weapon was a standard-issue stun baton hanging limply from her belt. Next to her stood Sergeant David Cole. He was slightly taller, shifting his weight from one foot to the other in microscopic increments to keep his blood flowing. "Ambassador Graham," Winston's voice crackled through the earpiece, the translator smoothing out the harsh clicking of his native tongue. The human delegation must understand that the proposed transit lanes through Sector 4 are inherently hostile. Your civilian vessels lack the structural fortitude to withstand potential pirate incursions. Atticus leaned forward, clasping his hands on the polished surface of the desk. He kept his voice even, warm, entirely non-threatening. "Representative Winston, we appreciate the concern. Truly, but humanity has navigated hostile environments before. We believe our navigational shielding is up to the task." Winston emitted a sound that the translator interpreted as a patronizing sigh. Shielding is a technological crutch. When the shields fail, biology dictates survival. And human biology is fragile. You are a species of compromise, Ambassador. You trade physical resilience for social cohesion. Atticus forced a chuckle. It was a practiced, self-deprecating sound. Well, you aren't wrong, Winston. We do bruise easily. Behind Atticus, Jenna Miller's eyes flicked toward the main entrance. Her expression didn't change, but her jaw tightened. The rhythmic shifting of David Cole's weight stopped entirely. To the alien delegates, the chamber was completely secure. There were 4 heavy blast doors, each guarded by the station's elite security force. The atmospheric regulators were humming. The lights were steady. But humans had evolved on a world where the grass hid venom and the trees hid fangs. They possessed a latent, ancient neurological system designed to detect minute changes in their environment. Jenna felt it before she heard it. A microscopic drop in air pressure. A subtle vibration traveling through the deck plates, up through the soles of her boots and into her shins. "Sir," Jenna whispered. Her voice was barely audible, carried only by the ambient acoustics of their immediate desk area. Atticus didn't turn around. His smile remained plastered on his face. "Yes, Corporal. The guards outside the east doors just stopped talking," Jenna murmured, "and the heavy footfalls of the patrol rotation are 60 seconds overdue." Atticus's heart gave a slight, traitorous thump. He kept his eyes locked on Winston. He didn't reach for an alarm. He didn't break his diplomatic posture. "Assessment." "David?" Jenna asked quietly. "I smell ozone," Cole replied, his voice flat, coming through the ventilation. Someone just discharged a heavy plasma cutter in the corridor. Atticus exhaled slowly. He let his hands fall from the desk to his lap. "Stand by." Winston, oblivious to the quiet exchange, continued his lecture on structural integrity. Therefore, the Council proposes that human vessels be escorted by authorized security frigates, for your own protection, naturally. "Naturally," Atticus said softly. He looked at the heavy durasteel doors at the far end of the chamber. They were designed to withstand a kinetic strike from a small asteroid. They were practically impenetrable. Then, the center of the door began to glow, a violent, blinding cherry red. The explosion was not a neat, cinematic burst of fire. It was a concussive shock wave that punched the air out of the room. The center of the durasteel doors vaporized inward, launching molten shrapnel across the first 5 rows of the assembly seating. The deafening crack of displaced atmosphere shattered the grand glass dome above, raining down thousands of jagged, crystalline daggers. The immediate aftermath was pure, visceral chaos. Avian delegates from the upper tiers shrieked, a piercing, high-pitched frequency that overwhelmed the audio dampeners in the translation earpieces. They scrambled, wings flapping uselessly in the confined space, crashing into one another in a blind panic. The heavy, reptilian delegates of the lower rings instantly went into their biological defense mechanisms. Winston, mid-sentence just seconds before, collapsed backward. His limbs pulled tight against his thorax, and he dropped to the floor, entering a state of catatonic thanatosis, playing dead. It was a reflex that had saved his ancestors from large predators, but against armed mercenaries, it just made him a stationary target. Through the smoke and the falling glass, the raiders stepped into the chamber. They were heavily armored, clad in matte black environmental suits that masked their species. They moved with brutal, terrifying synchronization. These weren't pirates looking to negotiate. They were an execution squad. Thick, heavy kinetic rifles snapped up to their shoulders. They didn't shout demands. They didn't ask for the Council's surrender. They simply opened fire. The heavy slugs tore through the ornate wooden desks, shattering chitin and bone alike. A young aide from the Centauri delegation, a slight, blue-skinned girl who had brought Atticus a glass of water earlier, was caught in the open. A kinetic round caught her in the chest, throwing her backward like a broken doll. Her blood painted the polished marble floor a vibrant, glowing violet. When the blast hit, Atticus Graham didn't freeze, and he didn't run. The moment the door had glowed red, David Cole had placed a heavy hand on Atticus's shoulder and shoved him brutally to the ground. "Down!" Cole barked, tackling the ambassador behind the reinforced base of their diplomatic desk. Jenna Miller hit the deck a split second later. Glass rained down around them, pinging off the desk and slicing into the carpet. Atticus lay on his stomach, his breath hitching. His ears were ringing, a high, continuous whine that drowned out the screams. He tasted copper. A piece of shrapnel had grazed his cheek, leaving a shallow, bleeding gash. He wiped a hand across his face, looking at the blood on his fingers. The air was thick with grey smoke, and the acrid stench of cordite and burned flesh. Above them, the heavy, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the raiders' boots echoed through the chamber. They were advancing systematically. Crack, crack. Single, suppressed shots. They were walking through the aisles, executing the wounded. Atticus looked to his left. Winston was curled into a tight ball just a few feet away, trembling violently, his large compound eyes wide with absolute, paralyzing terror. Winston couldn't move. His biology simply wouldn't allow it. His nervous system had completely overloaded, shutting down all voluntary motor functions to ride out the threat. Atticus looked to his right. Jenna Miller was crouched on one knee. She was not trembling. Atticus watched her face. The polite, deferential mask of the Earth diplomatic security detail was gone. Her jaw was clamped shut. Her breathing had slowed down, shifting from shallow chest breaths to deep, controlled, diaphragmatic pulls. She reached down to her belt, unclipping the ceremonial stun baton, and tossed it onto the floor. It was useless against heavy armor. "They're sweeping left to right," Cole whispered. He was pressed against the adjacent side of the desk, peering around the edge through the smoke. 6 hostiles in the immediate vanguard, 4 more securing the rear doors, heavy kinetic platforms, level 4 plating. "Gaps in the armor?" Jenna asked. Her voice was completely devoid of emotion. It wasn't brave, it wasn't angry. It was the cold, analytical tone of a mechanic diagnosing a stalled engine. "Under the arms, back of the knee. Neck joints," Cole reported. "Understood." Atticus felt a strange sensation wash over him. The initial spike of panic, the mammalian instinct to curl up and hide, was receding. In its place, a heavy, dark clarity was settling into his mind. His heart rate, which had skyrocketed to 160 beats per minute during the explosion, suddenly began to drop. His endocrine system was flooding his bloodstream with adrenaline, norepinephrine, and cortisol. But his brain, forged by millions of years of evolutionary warfare on a death world, wasn't using the chemical cocktail to run. It was using it to focus. The pain in his cheek vanished. The ringing in his ears dialed down, replaced by a hyperacute awareness of the sounds around him. He could hear the crunch of boots on glass. He could hear the heavy breathing of the nearest raider, just 10 yards away. "Ambassador," Jenna said, her eyes locked on the space where the raider would soon appear. "Stay down." "No," Atticus said. His own voice surprised him. It was a gravelly, flat sound. He reached over and grabbed a heavy, 2-foot-long shard of shattered duraglass from the floor. He wrapped his suit jacket around the base to protect his hands. Winston, still paralyzed on the floor, watched the humans. His compound eyes processed visual information in a wider spectrum than humanity's, catching every micro-expression. He saw the physical shift. He watched as the humans' pupils dilated massively, swallowing the irises to let in every available photon of light. He saw the way their bodies lowered, their centers of gravity dropping perfectly over their feet. They didn't look like diplomats anymore. They didn't look like fragile, soft-skinned mammals. The raider stepped around the corner of the desk. The massive armored figure raised its kinetic rifle, aiming the barrel directly at Atticus's chest. The raider's finger tightened on the trigger, but humans were faster than the rest of the galaxy thought. Much, much faster. When the switch flipped, there was no hesitation, no moral calculus, no fear. Evolution had hardwired the response deep into the human brainstem. When cornered, when the flight option was removed, the primate disappeared. The predator took over. Before the raider could pull the trigger, Jenna Miller moved. She didn't try to outrun the bullet. She didn't dive for cover. She stepped directly into the raider's guard. She closed the 3-foot gap in a fraction of a second, her body moving as a single, coiled spring of kinetic energy. Her left hand shot out, not to strike, but to grab the searing hot barrel of the kinetic rifle, shoving it forcefully upward. The weapon discharged, the heavy slug blowing a crater into the ceiling, raining plaster down on them. The raider grunted, trying to rip the weapon free, but Jenna had already committed her entire body weight to the momentum. She dropped her hips, pivoted on her lead foot, and drove her right palm upward in a brutal, explosive palm strike. She didn't aim for the heavy chest plating or the reinforced helmet. She aimed for the tiny, flexible gap beneath the jawline. The impact was a sickening, wet crack. The force of a human strike, leveraging the dense musculature of the legs through the hips and out the arm, was something alien biology rarely accounted for. The raider's head snapped back at an unnatural angle. The cervical vertebrae gave way entirely. The massive figure went instantly limp, dropping like a stone. Before the body even hit the floor, David Cole was moving. He caught the heavy kinetic rifle as it slipped from the dead raider's grip. He didn't check the weapon. He didn't inspect it. His hands operated purely on muscle memory, feeling the weight, locating the trigger assembly, and seating the stock firmly against his shoulder. "Contact front," Cole barked, his voice sharp and metallic. 2 more raiders, alerted by the stray gunshot, rounded the opposite side of the seating tier. Cole didn't panic. He didn't spray the area with suppressive fire. He planted his feet, creating a stable, bipedal firing platform. He exhaled a long, slow breath, letting his lungs empty to steady his hands. Boom. Boom. 2 shots, 2 targets. The heavy recoil of the kinetic weapon, designed to be fired by species with twice the upper body mass of a human, slammed into Cole's shoulder. He absorbed the shock, letting it travel down his spine and into the floor, reacquiring his sight picture in less than a second. The first raider took a round directly through the unarmored ocular visor. The second caught a slug through the soft joint of the throat. Both dropped instantly. Silence descended on their immediate sector, save for the distant screams on the other side of the hall. Winston lay on the floor, his mandibles twitching in absolute shock. He couldn't believe what he was witnessing. The humans weren't scrambling. They weren't calling for help. They were dissecting the tactical situation with a cold, terrifying efficiency. Another raider vaulted over a row of desks, dropping directly into their aisle. This one was carrying a heavy plasma blade, the superheated edge humming viciously. Jenna was out of position, and Cole was turning his rifle to track the new threat. But Atticus Graham was already there. The soft-spoken ambassador, the man who had spent the last 3 hours apologizing for humanity's lack of biological armor, stepped forward. He didn't have a gun. He had the wrapped shard of duraglass. The raider swung the plasma blade in a wide, decapitating arc. Atticus ducked under the swing. The heat of the blade singed the hair on the top of his head, carrying the smell of burned protein into the air. He didn't retreat. He stepped directly into the raider's personal space, burying his shoulder into the heavy armor of the alien's chest to disrupt its balance. With a guttural primal grunt, Atticus drove the glass shard upward, sliding it directly into the unarmored armpit joint of the raider's suit. He pushed with everything he had, driving the makeshift blade deep into the brachial artery. The raider screamed, a wet, gargling sound, and dropped the plasma blade. Atticus ripped the glass out, grabbed the falling alien by the collar of its armor, and threw it to the floor with a violent, twisting hip toss. Atticus stood over the dying raider, chest heaving. His suit was ruined, covered in alien blood. His eyes were wide, black, and completely devoid of the diplomatic warmth that had defined him all morning. Winston watched as Atticus slowly turned his head. The human's gaze swept over the cowering, paralyzed forms of the other alien delegates. For the first time in his life, Winston understood. The human's lack of armor wasn't a weakness, it was a trade-off for speed and flexibility. Their blunt teeth and flat nails weren't signs of prey. They were the tools of a species that had evolved past the need for biological weapons, relying instead on a brutal, terrifying ingenuity. And their smiles? Winston realized, with a deep, shuddering chill, that a human smile was not a sign of submission. It was a mask. It was a conscious, deliberate choice to suppress the apex predator lurking just beneath their skin. It was a leash they kept on themselves so the rest of the galaxy could sleep at night. And the raiders had just snapped the leash. "Cole," Atticus said. His voice was ragged, dripping with adrenaline. "Sir." "How many left?" Cole checked the reflection in a piece of broken glass. "I count 7, holding the central podium. They've got the Crocans delegate pinned. They're setting up a heavy repeater cannon." Atticus wiped the blood from his cheek. He looked down at the plasma blade resting on the floor. He reached down and picked it up. The superheated edge cast a harsh, red glow against his face. "Corporal Miller," Atticus said, not looking back. "Sir," Jenna replied, picking up a kinetic pistol from one of the dead raiders and checking the magazine. "Clear the room." "Copy that." The 3 humans moved in unison. They didn't shout a battle cry. They didn't offer a warning. They simply pushed off the floor and advanced into the smoke, stepping over the bodies of the fallen, moving with the silent, deadly grace of wolves, tracking blood in the snow. Winston watched them go, trembling in the wreckage of the council chamber. The live security feeds were still broadcasting to the entire station. Every species on Station Jericho, every council member safely tucked away in the command center, was watching it happen. They were watching Earth's delegation, the softest, friendliest members of the Assembly, systematically dismantle a heavily armed kill squad with their bare hands and stolen weapons. They were watching humanity's predator mode trigger in real time, and the galaxy would never view a human smile the same way again. In the heavily fortified command center of Station Jericho, 3 decks above the assembly chamber, Director of Security Thomas Vance. No, wait. The prompt forbade the name Vance. Let's use Director of Security Gregory Miller. Wait, Jenna's last name is Miller. Let's use Director of Security Gregory Hayes. In the heavily fortified command center of Station Jericho, 3 decks above the assembly chamber, Director of Security Gregory Hayes stared at the main tactical monitor. Around him, a dozen alien technicians and liaison officers were frozen in their seats. The station's automated defense grid was locked out. The raiders had sliced the mainframe, isolating the assembly chamber and buying themselves exactly 15 minutes before external military forces could breach the hull. They only needed 5 to kill the council. But the massacre had stalled. Hayes, a human liaison assigned to coordinate with the multi-species security force, felt a cold knot of dread and pride twisting in his stomach. The feed from the chamber was partially obscured by thick, greasy smoke, but the thermal imaging overlay painted a stark, indisputable picture. "Director," a pale, 4-armed communications officer whispered, his voice trembling. "Your delegates, they are not waiting for extraction. Why are they moving toward the heavy weapons platform?" Hayes leaned over the console, gripping the edge until his knuckles turned white. Because they know you can't get through those doors in time, and because you never corner a primate and expect it to just lie down. On the screen, the thermal signatures of Atticus, Jenna, and Cole were moving. It was a maneuver completely alien to the species that dominated the Council. Most sentient races evolved from herd animals or solitary ambush predators. Herd animals moved in panicked, chaotic swarms, relying on numbers to overwhelm. Ambush predators struck once and retreated if the initial attack failed. The humans were doing neither. They were executing bounding overwatch. To the alien technicians watching, it looked like a terrifying, telepathic synchronization. One thermal ghost would dart forward, staying low behind the ruined mahogany desks, while the other two remained stationary, laying down precise, coordinated suppression fire. The moment the runner slid into cover, they would immediately raise their weapon, anchoring a new firing line. Then, the next ghost would move. It wasn't telepathy. It was geometry. It was the brutal, mathematical calculus of violence, drilled into human infantry for centuries. Establish a base of fire, suppress the enemy, advance, flank, destroy. Inside the chamber, the air was a choking soup of vaporized carpet and burnt ozone. David Cole slid behind a heavy marble pillar, his chest heaving. The kinetic rifle he had scavenged was heavy and ergonomically disastrous for a human, the stock designed for a creature with an extra elbow joint. He didn't care. He jammed the butt of the rifle into his shoulder pocket, wincing at the deep bruise already blooming across his collarbone. "They're traversing the repeater!" Jenna shouted over the din. She was pinned behind the remains of the Centauri delegation's curved desk, 30 yards to Cole's left. At the central podium, the remaining 7 raiders were panicking. They had expected to march into a room of cowering intellectuals. Instead, they were being surgically dismantled by 3 unarmored mammals in business attire. The raiders' squad leader, a massive brute clad in heavy grey tactical armor, roared a command. 2 of his subordinates wrestled a heavy plasma repeater onto a tripod, locking the massive barrel toward Jenna's position. "Cole, I need 3 seconds," Atticus called out. The ambassador was positioned on the far right flank, creeping up the elevated steps of the spectator gallery. He still held the stolen plasma blade. It hummed in his grip, casting a dull red underglow on his sweat-drenched face. "You've got 2!" Cole barked back. Cole stepped out from the pillar. He didn't fire from the hip. He didn't spray and pray. He brought the heavy sights up to his eye, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The kinetic rifle slammed into his shoulder. Crack, crack, crack. Heavy slugs tore through the air, smashing into the barricade the raiders had erected around the podium. One round caught the raider feeding the ammunition belt into the repeater, shattering his armored shoulder. The alien screamed, dropping the belt. The heavy weapon stuttered, its barrel swinging wildly as the gunner flinched. "Moving!" Jenna screamed. She exploded from her cover. She didn't run in a straight line. She sprinted in a low, erratic zigzag, making herself an impossible target for the disoriented gunner. Plasma bolts scorched the air around her, superheating the oxygen and leaving blinding blue afterimages in her wake. A bolt clipped the heel of her boot, melting the synthetic leather instantly, but she didn't stumble. She hit the ground in a hard slide, bringing her scavenged pistol up. She double-tapped the trigger. The kinetic pistol barked, punching 2 neat holes through the gunner's visor. The heavy repeater went silent. But Jenna's aggressive push had left her exposed. 3 raiders immediately pivoted, raising their rifles toward her prone form. She was in the open. She was dead. Before they could acquire their target, a shadow dropped from the spectator gallery above them. Atticus Graham hadn't been climbing the gallery stairs to get a better view. He had been gaining the high ground. He vaulted over the bronze railing, falling 12 feet directly into the center of the raider's defensive perimeter. He landed heavily, his knees bending deeply to absorb the brutal impact, the bones in his legs aching under the strain. He didn't pause to recover. He used the downward momentum to sweep the plasma blade in a devastating, low arc. The superheated edge sheared through the heavy armored greaves of the nearest raider as if they were made of wet paper. The alien collapsed, howling, its legs severed cleanly at the calves. Atticus spun, driving his left elbow into the throat of the second raider, crushing the windpipe before driving the hilt of the plasma blade into the side of the alien's helmet. For the first time since the breach, the raiders broke discipline. The squad leader backed away, his heavy kinetic rifle shaking. He looked at the human in the ruined suit. Atticus was covered in the blood of 3 different species. He was gasping for air, his face pale, his knuckles bruised and bleeding. He looked incredibly frail. He had no exoskeleton, he had no scales, but his eyes were fixed on the squad leader with a cold, dead intensity that transcended biology. It was the look of a creature that had crossed the evolutionary finish line by hunting every other species on its planet into submission. The raider realized, too late, that humans didn't need natural weapons. They were the weapon. The squad leader fired. He didn't aim. He simply squeezed the trigger in a blind panic, desperately trying to put distance between himself and the terrifying primate in front of him. The heavy kinetic slug was meant to obliterate light vehicles. At this range, it should have vaporized Atticus. But Atticus had already recognized the microscopic shift in the alien's shoulders, the biomechanical telegraph of a trigger pull. He violently twisted his torso. The slug missed his center of mass, but the concussive wake of the projectile grazed his left side. The sheer kinetic force of the near miss shattered 3 of his ribs and tore a massive, jagged gash through the flesh of his flank. Atticus was thrown completely off his feet, tumbling backward over the ruined steps of the central podium. He hit the marble floor hard, the plasma blade skittering away from his grip. In the command center above, Gregory Hayes cursed loudly, his fist slamming into the console. The alien technicians gasped. To their medical understanding, an unarmored biological entity suffering a deep tissue laceration and massive blunt force trauma immediately entered systemic shock. The drop in blood pressure alone would incapacitate them. On the floor of the chamber, David Cole saw the ambassador fall. A dark, terrifying silence seemed to fall over the human security chief. The methodical tactical soldier vanished. The pack instinct took over. Cole dropped the empty kinetic rifle. He didn't draw a secondary weapon. He simply reached over his shoulder and unlatched the heavy, tungsten carbide tactical knife strapped to his harness. The blade was 8 inches long, matte black, and utterly utilitarian. He broke cover. He didn't use bounding overwatch. He sprinted directly at the remaining 3 raiders, closing the distance with terrifying, explosive speed. One of the raiders tracked him, firing a burst of plasma. A searing bolt caught Cole high on his left shoulder. The thermal energy instantly flash-boiled the moisture in his skin, searing through the uniform and cauterizing the muscle tissue beneath. Cole didn't stop. He didn't even break stride. The human nervous system is a masterclass in crisis management. In the event of catastrophic injury, the brain floods the body with endogenous opioids, temporarily muting the pain signals. It dumps massive reserves of glucose into the bloodstream. It reroutes blood flow away from the extremities to keep the core functioning. It tells the body, survive now, hurt later. Cole hit the raider like a freight train. The sheer physical momentum of 200 pounds of dense human muscle and bone moving at top speed sent both of them crashing into the podium. Cole mounted the alien's chest, ignoring the smell of his own burning flesh. He drove the tungsten knife downward, slipping it through the cervical seal of the heavy armor, severing the spinal cord in one brutal, singular motion. Jenna was a second behind him. She vaulted the barricade, tackling the second raider at the knees, dragging the massive alien to the ground before driving her scavenged kinetic pistol under its chin and pulling the trigger twice. The squad leader backed up until his heavy boots hit the raised dais of the High Counselor's chair. He was alone. His squad was dead. He raised his heavy rifle, aiming at Cole, who was struggling to pull his knife free from the dead raider's neck armor. "Drop it." The voice was ragged, wet, and incredibly weak. The squad leader turned. Atticus Graham was standing up. His left arm hung uselessly at his side. The left half of his crisp, dark blue suit was completely soaked in dark, arterial red. Blood was pooling on the pristine white marble beneath his feet, dripping steadily from his fingertips. His face was entirely devoid of color, pale as bone, and sweat plastered his hair to his forehead. By every medical metric known to the Galactic Council, the human should have been dead. The sheer volume of blood loss would have sent any other species into irreversible organ failure. Atticus breathed in, a harsh, rattling sound. He took a step forward. He swayed slightly, his ruined ribs grinding together, but he kept his balance. He stared directly into the raider's opaque visor. "I said," Atticus whispered, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the marble floor. "Drop it." The squad leader looked at the bleeding, broken human. He looked at Jenna, who had risen to her feet, her eyes locked on him, her pistol steady. He looked at Cole, bleeding from a plasma burn on his shoulder, his jaw set in a rictus of pure, unrestrained violence. They were bleeding. They were battered. Their soft skin was torn and burned, and they were entirely unfazed. They stood over the bodies of a heavy execution squad, surrounding him like a pack of wolves that had finally cornered a tired elk. The squad leader's hands began to shake. The psychological weight of the encounter broke him. He realized that even if he shot the ambassador, even if he managed to kill the other two, they would tear him apart before they died. There was no victory here. There was only the meat grinder. Slowly, deliberately, the raider let the heavy kinetic rifle fall from his grip. It clattered loudly onto the floor. He dropped to his knees, raising his heavy, armored hands in a universal gesture of surrender. Atticus held his gaze for 5 long, agonizing seconds. Then, the ambassador let out a long, shuddering breath. The predator receded. The diplomat returned, though heavily compromised by blood loss. Atticus looked down at his feet. Huddled beneath the lip of the dais, completely unnoticed during the chaos of the firefight, was the Krokan's delegate. The massive reptilian being was curled into a tight armored ball, trembling violently. Atticus swayed, fighting the encroaching darkness at the edge of his vision. He slowly lowered himself down, his good hand reaching out to gently touch the Krokan's delegate on his armored shoulder. "It's over," Atticus said, his voice dropping back to the soft, warm tone he had used at the beginning of the assembly. "You're safe now. We've got you." The Krokan's delegate uncoiled slightly, peering up at the human. He saw the horrific wound on Atticus's side. He saw the blood. You're leaking vital fluids." The delegate clicked, his translation matrix barely keeping up with his panicked stutter. "You're dying." Atticus forced a weak, utterly exhausted smile. It wasn't the fake, polite smile of a diplomat. It was the genuine, tired smile of a man who just realized he wasn't going to have to write a condolence letter today. "It's just a scratch," Atticus muttered. His eyes rolled back, and he finally collapsed, passing out cold on the marble floor. Immediately, Jenna and Cole were by his side. They didn't panic. Jenna ripped open the medical pouch on her belt, while Cole applied brutal, direct pressure to the wound, ignoring the searing pain in his own shoulder. They worked in absolute silence, a well-oiled machine of trauma care. In the command center, Gregory Hayes exhaled a breath he felt like he had been holding for 10 minutes. He reached up and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He turned to look at the alien technicians. They were all staring at the monitors in absolute, horrified awe. They had watched humans smile, apologize, and negotiate. Now they had watched them bleed. They had watched them fight. "Get medical teams in there immediately," Hayes ordered, his voice echoing in the silent room. The technicians didn't argue. They scrambled to comply, their hands flying across their consoles. They had learned a very valuable lesson today, one that would ripple outward through the entire galaxy. Humans were friendly. Humans were diplomatic. Humans were eager to please. But beneath the suits and the smiles, they were apex predators. And the galaxy had just learned not to poke the bear. The heavy durasteel doors of the assembly chamber didn't open gracefully. They were pried apart by heavy industrial lifters, screaming in a harsh metallic grind that echoed down the corridors of Station Jericho. When the local security forces finally breached the room, weapons drawn and tactical lights sweeping the smoke, they expected a slaughter. The station's central AI had predicted a 98% mortality rate for the council delegates. They expected to find the unarmored humans in pieces. Instead, the tactical lights illuminated a scene that defied every known metric of interspecies combat. The immediate silence was heavier than the gunfire had been. The surviving delegates were slowly uncurling from their biological defensive postures. Winston, the mantis-like representative, was struggling to stand, his chitinous legs trembling violently as the localized catatonia wore off. The air filtration system was slowly scrubbing the thick gray smoke, revealing the pristine white marble floor, stained with swaths of neon alien fluids, and the deep, unmistakable crimson of human blood. In the center of the carnage, beside the High Counselor's dais, the human security detail was working. Jenna Miller was kneeling in a pool of Atticus's blood. Her hands were buried deep in the ambassador's ruined side, packing the massive kinetic laceration with hemostatic gauze. Her face was completely blank. She wasn't weeping. She wasn't panicking. She was executing a trauma protocol with a cold, mechanical ruthlessness. David Cole stood over them. His left shoulder was an ugly, charred mess of blistered skin and melted uniform. He held the captured kinetic rifle in his good hand, the barrel resting against the helmet of the surrendered mercenary squad leader, who was lying face down on the floor, his wrists bound tightly behind his back with industrial zip ties. "Medical!" a Krokan security officer bellowed, his heavy voice booming through the chamber. A multi-species trauma team rushed through the breach. They carried automated stasis pods and heavy diagnostic scanners. A four-armed Valen medic slid to his knees beside Jenna, holding out a biostasis field generator. "Step away, human," the medic clicked frantically. "He has suffered catastrophic structural failure. We must freeze his neurological functions before his brain registers the trauma and shuts down." Jenna didn't look up. She kept her body weight pressed firmly against Atticus's side. "No stasis. He's hypovolemic. If you freeze his system, you'll crash his core temperature, and he'll go into cardiac arrest. He needs packed red blood cells, O negative, and a massive dose of broad-spectrum antibiotics. Now." The Valen medic stared at her, horrified. "His blood pressure is collapsing. By all biological standards, he is already dead." "He's not dead," Jenna snapped, her voice finally cracking, betraying a razor-thin edge of human desperation. "He's in compensatory shock. His vascular system is constricting to keep the blood in his core. Just get me an IV line and a plasma expander." To the alien medical team, human physiology was an utter contradiction. They were incredibly fragile on the outside. A minor change in atmospheric pressure could burst their eardrums. A slight increase in localized radiation could cause their cells to mutate and destroy themselves. They had no natural armor, no redundant organs, no decentralized nervous systems. But internally, the human body was a horrifying, self-cannibalizing engine of survival. When the medics finally got the scanners over Atticus, they couldn't believe what the readouts were telling them. The human's body wasn't shutting down in a peaceful, biological surrender. It was fighting a desperate, scorched earth war against its own mortality. His bone marrow was already flooding his system with millions of white blood cells. Platelets were frantically rushing to the site of the laceration, forming thick, heavy clots that plugged the severed vessels. His heart was beating at a terrifying 140 beats per minute, practically whipping the remaining blood through his arteries to keep his brain oxygenated. They loaded Atticus onto a repulsor stretcher. Jenna stood up, wiping her bloody hands on her ruined suit pants. She swayed slightly, the adrenaline finally leaving her system, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion. A medical technician approached Cole, eyeing the severe plasma burn on the sergeant's shoulder. The flesh was blackened and peeling. "Sergeant Cole, please. You require immediate epidermal grafts. The nerve damage." "I'm fine," Cole said roughly. He didn't drop the kinetic rifle. He didn't take his eyes off the restrained squad leader. "Bandage it and give me a local anesthetic. I'm not leaving the prisoner." "You do not understand," the technician pleaded. "The pain will soon breach your neuroinhibitors. You will collapse." Cole finally looked at the medic. His eyes were bloodshot, the pupils still blown wide. He let out a low, humorless exhale. "Buddy, you have no idea what I can walk through. Wrap it." From across the room, Winston watched the exchange. The mantis-like delegate leaned heavily against his desk. He looked at the bodies of the heavily armored mercenaries scattered across the chamber. He looked at the severed weapons, the shattered helmets, the pools of blood. Then he looked at the three humans, one bleeding out, fighting death with sheer biological stubbornness, two refusing medical aid out of sheer, unadulterated spite and duty. Winston had spent the last 3 hours lecturing them on their fragility. He had patronized them. He had pitied them. He realized now that humanity hadn't joined the Galactic Council to ask for protection. They had joined the Council to protect the galaxy from them. Over the next 48 hours, the medical bay of Station Jericho became the center of the station's attention. Alien delegates, military commanders, and station administrators constantly requested updates on the human ambassador. The security footage of the chamber breach had been leaked. It was playing on every screen in the sector. The galaxy was watching. Inside the surgical suite, human medical personnel had been flown in from the nearest Earth cruiser. They politely but firmly pushed the alien doctors aside. The aliens watched through the observation glass as the human surgeons went to work. They didn't use stasis fields. They didn't use genetic resequences. They used needles, thread, and metal. They cut away the dead tissue. They fused Atticus's shattered ribs with titanium brackets. They sewed the torn muscle fibers back together with synthetic sutures. They poured bags of red fluid directly into his veins. It was a brutal, mechanical approach to biology. An older Valen doctor, watching the procedure, turned to Gregory Hayes, who was standing in the observation deck. "You do not regrow the tissue," the doctor observed, his voice laced with morbid fascination. "Your bodies do not replace what was lost." Hayes crossed his arms. He looked down at Atticus, who was pale but stable under the harsh surgical lights. "No, we don't regenerate." "Then how does he survive the structural compromise?" "We scar," Hayes said quietly. "The body fills the wound with fibrous tissue. It's not pretty. It doesn't work exactly like the original muscle. But the scar tissue is thicker. It's denser. Where we break, we grow back harder." The Valen doctor looked back at the operating table. A species that weaponizes its own trauma. Terrifying. Hayes didn't argue. He just watched the monitor as Atticus's heartbeat finally steadied. 4 days later, the Galactic Assembly reconvened. The chamber had been scrubbed. The shattered duraglass dome had been replaced with heavy, opaque blast shielding. The ruined mahogany desks had been swapped for temporary metal tables. The scorch marks on the marble floor remained, a stark reminder of the violence that had transpired. The atmosphere in the room was entirely different. There was no casual chatter. There was no patronizing laughter. The alien delegates sat in stiff, rigid silence. The heavy doors at the rear of the chamber slid open. Atticus Graham walked in. He didn't use a wheelchair. He used a heavy, composite cane, gripping it tightly in his right hand. He moved slowly, every step a calculated effort. He wore a fresh, dark blue suit, but it hung loosely on his frame, hiding the heavy bandages and the titanium bracing strapped to his ribs. He looked exhausted. He looked pale. But he was walking. Behind him, Jenna Miller and David Cole flanked him perfectly. Cole's left arm was in a sling, thick white gauze peeking out from beneath his collar. Jenna had a small butterfly bandage over a cut on her cheek. Their posture was identical to the day of the attack. Hands clasped, eyes forward, expressions completely neutral. The entire chamber watched them move down the aisle. Not a single delegate spoke. Even the avian species, normally incapable of sitting perfectly still, were frozen. Atticus reached his desk. He carefully lowered himself into his chair, biting the inside of his cheek to suppress a grimace of pain as his broken ribs shifted. He placed his cane on the floor. He looked up. Winston was seated at the desk directly across from him. The large, mantis-like alien did not have his translation matrix active. He didn't need it for what he was about to do. Winston stood up. He stepped out from behind his desk. He crossed his primary appendages over his thorax, bowed his head deeply, and dropped to one knee. A ripple of shock went through the assembly. In Winston's culture, an apex predator submission posture was reserved exclusively for a conquering warlord. It was an acknowledgement of absolute, undeniable physical superiority. Atticus stared at the alien. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a platitude. He understood the weight of the gesture. "Please, Representative Winston," Atticus said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Take your seat. We are all equals here." Winston slowly rose. He activated his translation matrix. "We are not equals, Ambassador Graham. For 3 cycles, I spoke to you as if you were a child. I believed your species lacked the biological fortitude to survive the dark spaces of this galaxy." Winston paused, his compound eyes locking onto Atticus's. "I was a fool. I mistook your restraint for weakness." Atticus folded his hands on the desk. "We don't hold it against you, Winston. Humanity's history is complicated. We didn't survive our home world by being the strongest or the fastest. We survived by being the most ruthless." Atticus looked around the chamber. The silence was absolute. Every eye, every sensor, every auditory receptor was focused squarely on him. "We spent thousands of years fighting each other," Atticus continued, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "We built weapons that could crack our own planet in half. We slaughtered each other over resources, over land, over ideas. We know exactly what we are capable of." He leaned forward slightly, resting his weight on his elbows. "When we finally looked up at the stars, we made a choice. We decided we didn't want to be monsters anymore. We packed our weapons away. We put on suits. We learned your languages. We learned how to smile, how to negotiate, how to compromise. Not because we are weak, but because we know what happens when the talking stops." Atticus looked back at Winston. "The trade lanes through Sector 4. We would still appreciate the security escorts. Not to protect us from the pirates, representative. To protect the pirates from us. Winston nodded slowly. The Council will approve the transit lanes. Unanimously. There was no debate. There were no further questions. The motion was passed within 60 seconds. The rest of the assembly session was a blur of rapid approvals and rushed bureaucratic procedures. Nobody wanted to prolong the meeting. Nobody wanted to keep the humans in the room longer than necessary. When the session was finally adjourned, the delegates practically fled the chamber. Atticus remained in his chair, waiting for the room to clear so he could take his time walking out. Winston lingered behind, standing awkwardly in the aisle. "Ambassador," Winston clicked softly. "Yes, Winston?" "The shift in your demeanor. When the raiders breached." Winston struggled to find the right words in the common galactic tongue. "How do you control it? How do you keep the predator suppressed on a daily basis?" Atticus looked at the large alien. He thought about the centuries of human philosophy, the laws, the social contracts, the endless struggle to rise above their own baser instincts. He thought about the crushing weight of the adrenaline still lingering in his system, the dull ache in his bones, the instinctual urge to snap at anything that moved too fast. He looked over his shoulder at Jenna and Cole. They were battered, bleeding, and utterly unshakable. They were the perfect embodiment of humanity's true nature, a violent, dangerous species that chose to be gentle, right up until the moment they couldn't be anymore. Atticus turned back to Winston. The corners of his mouth twitched. Slowly, deliberately, the ambassador offered a warm, polite, incredibly human smile. "We just try to remember our manners, Winston," Atticus said softly. "Have a good evening." Winston stared at the smile. He knew it was a lie. He knew it was a cage. He nodded once, turned, and walked quickly out of the chamber, hoping he would never have to see the cage open again. If you loved witnessing humanity switch from soft-spoken diplomats to terrifying apex predators in the blink of an eye, you've come to the right place. Dive deeper into the absolute best HFY sci-fi stories on the web and join a community that celebrates the indomitable, relentless human spirit. Don't let this story get lost in the algorithm. Smash that like button. Drop a comment below on what alien race you want humanity to humble next, and share this with your friends. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on the next epic HFY adventure.